Hello there, welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room where today I'm going to be talking about how to choose fabrics. When I was asking for questions for my recent sewing Q&A, I'll put a card up to that video here. I had many questions about how to choose the right fabric, how to shop for fabric online, how much fabric do I need for such and such project, etc. A lot of different fabric related questions. So today I thought I would hopefully try and answer most of them with a dedicated video talking all about how to choose fabrics, a little bit more about fabrics in general as well, because this is a large and vast topic and a steep learning curve that I can understand when you're just getting into sewing. There's not a lot of great resources on this, and because so much of it is tactile, it is harder to teach, and so that's kind of, I think, why there isn't much out there about this certain topic, because it's not exactly very easy to teach, especially over something like online. Now, I do have another video here on the channel that is more of a introduction to textiles in general, talking a little bit more about fibers and like really the very basics of textiles and materials. So if you'd like to watch that video first, I will put a card up to it here, and I will also link to it down into this in the description of this video, just because I think it's important to understand the very basics of like what we are even talking about when we're talking about fabrics. I'll get into a tiny bit today, but I do discuss it in a little bit more detail in that video. So there are several different things to consider when we are choosing a fabric for a project or choosing a project for a fabric. Either way you're going about this, people like me who've been sewing for a long time, perhaps, or people who have been crafting in general and been having to walk around craft stores where things have been tempting for a long time, usually have a stash of fabrics. Usually we have some fabrics that we have fallen in love with. Maybe you ran into the fabric store to pick up some thread to match the project you were already working on and came home with a couple lengths of fabric because they just caught your eye. So oftentimes people like myself end up with fabrics just in our stash that don't have a project necessarily with them yet. So we can go through our stash and we'll have to choose a project to match a textile that we already own. Or maybe you have an idea or see something and you have a design in mind and you don't know what fabric to use to execute that design. So whichever way you're starting from with this, the same considerations need to be taken into account for matching the design and the fabric together. Now, the first consideration when choosing a fabric is, of course, the fiber. What is the fabric itself? What is the material made out of? Because cotton is not a fabric, it is a fiber. This is something that I went over again in more detail in that other video, but we have natural fibers and we have synthetic fibers, and each fiber has a different kind of properties to it, or has different properties to it. Some things are more washable than others, so that's something to consider if you don't want to have to always be dry cleaning your clothes. Some things are warmer than others, like if you live in a very cold climate, wool is probably going to be a friend of yours, unless you're allergic. But if you live in a very warm climate, you're probably never going to be reaching for wools. I mean, wools are quite breathable. There's like nice wool suiting, but like in general terms, lightweight cottons and linens are probably going to be more a safe bet, especially because, again, they can be thrown in the wash, whereas something like wools, some suiting wools, especially nicer lightweight suiting wools, tropical weight suiting is what you'll usually hear it called, those sometimes have to be dry cleaned. So if you want something that you can wear in the heat and then throw in the wash, cotton is going to be more your friend. So fibers have a lot of considerations just within themselves, and of course that is going to be a major factor in deciding what fabric you want to use. Another big thing about fiber content is that it will sometimes often determine the cost of a material. Obviously heavy silk textiles in general are going to be more expensive. Nicer wools are going to be more expensive. Even premium polyesters that are like designer level polyester fabrics are going to be more expensive. They may be made of recycled materials. There are many reasons why a textile could be more expensive of any fiber content. Some rayons are more expensive than others. Some cottons are more expensive than others. But in general, silks and wools are going to be your most top tier expensive fabrics. And that is also, often a consideration when it comes to choosing a fabric, is how much it is going to cost. Now, already with this first consideration, we've run into another problem, which is mystery fabrics. So I know a lot of you go out thrifting like I do, or maybe go estate sailing or end up inheriting fabrics, or kind of, hand-me-down fabrics find their way to you, and you may not know exactly what the fiber content is. You don't have a nice breakdown of all the information about a textile when it enters into your stash or enters into your life in general. And there are several ways to determine what something is made out of. Usually those are going to be burn tests, and there are a lot of different videos or resources on the internet about burn tests. So you can take a couple of threads or a small sample of the textile from like a corner or a frayed area, hold that in some tweezers, don't hold it in your hands before you light it on fire. But you're going to see what happens when you put fire to that textile, because like wool, for example, as soon as you start trying to burn that, there's going to be a certain reaction to the fibers, but also it's going to smell like burning hair, and that will be a pretty telltale sign that you have burning hair, which is wool is animal hair. So, I mean, that's going to be a very good indicator that what you have is wool. or something might smell very like acrid and chemical, and you might think, okay, this is going to be a thermoplastic fiber. Some fabrics, like acetate, dissolve in acetone. So that's like a simple thing that you may have in the house that you can use to test a fabric. So there are many different ways of testing mystery fabrics to find out exactly what the fiber content is. And the more you work with different textiles and different fibers, the easier it's going to become to kind of be able to do it just on feel. Now, I use this as a skill I use a lot when I am out thrifting, because when I'm going through the racks of clothes, I'm looking for cotton, rayon, or silk, and I can skip most things because I can feel what they are just as I'm going across the hangers. So you do pick up this like kind of finger skill after a long time of being able to feel a fabric and knowing immediately it's either thermoplastic or natural, at least. Now, the second big consideration, I think, when it comes to choosing fabrics is if you are looking for a woven or a knit. Now, I personally don't usually sew with knits. Very rarely. This gold evening gown I made last year technically is a knit, but it doesn't stretch very much, so it acts mostly like a woven, and I treated it like a woven. Knits being things like jerseys, t-shirt fabric, a lot of modern clothes are made out of knits. You get a lot of ponte knits, which is like a thicker, kind of spongier feeling knit. A lot of double knits, and like double face knits, where something like, if you ever had like fleece lined leggings, where like the back of it has like almost a fleece texture and the front is more like a t-shirt jersey texture. There's a lot of different knits that get used in clothing now, or like sweatshirts that have like the fuzzy interior, but the outside is a sweatshirt fabric. Those are the knits we interact with most of the time in the modern world here. But I, in my sewing room, interact with essentially zero knits. So I am not the expert for you if you are more interested in knit fabrics and stretchy clothes. I use almost exclusively woven fabric. Now, again, I'd explained the difference a little bit more in my other textiles video, but woven fabrics are like the top of a cherry pie, I always say. They're interlocking threads. The pattern of how they interlock can be different. We might get into this a little bit more later. I'll show you some other like patterns of different weaves. Those are what the different names of fabrics are indicating, is what the way the fabrics threads are intertwined is what makes up, like, say, a satin weave or a twill weave or a plain weave. A plain weave being the cherry pie kind, where it's just over, under, over, under, over, under. And wovens, you know, we usually say knits stretch, wovens do not stretch, but wovens can be blends that have a little bit of elastane or spandex in them. A lot of the cotton satines I use are a sateen weave, which by its nature not necessarily doesn't stretch, but because the fibers have been, the fibers have been mixed and blended into the threads, so when the fabric is woven out of those threads, it then has a little bit of stretch involved, or at least that's the way I can explain it in the most basic way. So a lot of times I will have a woven fabric like cotton sateen that does have a little bit of stretch in it. And when I buy fabrics, I'm usually buying them from, I don't usually buy secondhand textiles. I know, we've talked about it a little bit more recently, but I'm usually buying them from Mood or even fabric sellers online, like on Etsy, that will tell me like, oh, there's 3% elastane, so I will know it has a little bit of stretch in it. And in fact, I'll know exactly how much, but I doubt anyone will ever be like, hey, how much elastane does your dress have in it? It's not something I'll ever need to know in the future. It just means that it'll be a tiny bit stretchy in the width-wise of the fabric, which is always nice to have a little bit of stretch in your garments, of course, if you tend to breathe or move or eat in them. Now, like I said in my other textiles video, which I just keep referencing, you need one term from each of these buckets. So you have your fibers and you have your weaves, and you need one of each. You can't just say, I would like to make a cotton dress. I mean, you can, but then you need to have one of these. You have cotton, you have your first thing, but you're going to need another one over here. Do you want a cotton poplin dress, a cotton sateen dress, a cotton twill dress? These are different weaves or properties of woven fabric that you're going to need to know. So over here you can have like a rayon twill, a silk twill, a wool twill. So you need one from this bucket and one from the other. For example, if you want, say, a bias cut, silky 1930s slinky gown, you don't want silk because it's shiny. Yes, silk can be shiny, but so can polyester. You don't want silk, you want silk charmeuse. You want silk like crepe back satin. You don't, you're going to need to know the weave that you want as well as the fiber. But even once we have our fiber and perhaps the weave decided or determined, like if you're deciding for a design, or if you have determined what you have, like a silk twill in your stash, that's still not the end of the considerations of whether or not that textile will work for the design you have in mind. Because you can have, let's say for rayon crepe, you can have a lightweight rayon crepe and you can have a heavier weight rayon crepe. And they are going to have a little bit different properties even from there on when it comes to weight. You can also have like a lightweight crisp cotton twill and a heavyweight denim-y cotton twill. So even within one fabric cotton twill, there are still many variations when it comes to things like the weight of it. Usually lighter weight fabrics tend to be on the possibly sheerer side. That isn't always true. If you have something that is densely woven or loosely woven, this is another consideration that kind of comes into play when it comes to things like weight, because obviously the more threads per inch, usually you hear about this when it comes to things like sheets, threads per inch, like how tightly the interlocking structure is done. So either the threads are packed in and there's, hundreds of threads per inch, and that because there's more threads, it's going to be a little bit of a heavier fabric, but is also just going to behave differently than something that is loosely woven. A lot of times you'll get things like, what's it called? Not tweed. Boucle, like cotton boucles. Like if you imagine like Chanel tweed jackets, those are usually interlined because the fabric itself is usually actually kind of a loose weave, which means that no matter what textile it's made out of, the looser the weave, the more drapey it's going to be because there's just so much air in the structure of the fabric itself. There's so much room for those threads to move around and be drapey and floopy. So like thread count and how tightly woven the fabric is can also come into play when it comes to like weight, which is almost a little bit of a little separate side note I almost forgot to throw in here. But most fabric retailers, not really in person unless you're like reading the information off the bolt, they may have it, but definitely online will usually have the grams per square meter or ounces per square yard of a fabric, so you can kind of compare them at least to one another. Or if you've ordered at least one rayon crepe before and you know that it was like 3 ounces per square yard and you thought it was too lightweight, you'll know next time I want to order something that is at least 4 ounces per yard. And then you can kind of start to build up a library in your brain of like likes and dislikes and pros and cons, so that you will know, oh, anytime I've worked with something that was only a 2.5 weight challis, I haven't liked that experience. So I want to try and bump up to a heavier weight fabric next time and see if I like that better, or vice versa and bump down. So it's good to know. And you can go on to those websites and look and see that weight that's listed for fabrics that you are familiar with. So let's say you're familiar with working with quilting cotton. We'll find out the quilting cottons that you usually use, like if you're from a certain brand or a certain store, find out what the grams per square meter is or the ounces per yard of that fabric is, and then you'll have a good baseline for being like, okay, so if something is less than this, then it'll weigh less than what I'm used to, and something is heavier than this, then it'll weigh more. A lot of times also online fabric retailers, at least for new fabrics as opposed to vintage fabrics when they might not have as much information, they will include details in the description that'll be useful to you. So they'll say like lighter weight rayon twill, bit sheer, may need a lining. Or they'll say like heavier weight twill wool suiting holds its shape well, best for structured suiting. So then you can know like not to try and create something very drapey out of it because it's going to have a certain crispness to it. And most twill weaves do have a certain crispness to it, but we'll get into that a little bit more later. But consult those descriptions. Do they have any extra information for you that will tell you if that's going to be a good fabric for your chosen design? Sometimes, I'm shopping with Mood most of the time, and they in their descriptions are quite good about saying, we recommend one of our linings with this because it's kind of translucent. And of course they're trying to upsell you lining, but also you now know something about that fabric. It's probably going to need a lining because it's quite translucent. And if you were looking for something sheer, then great. And if you were not, then you know to look for a different fabric. So the descriptions can be a good resource to look into if you're just not as familiar as working with different fabrics. And then another consideration is going to be color and pattern, the style of the design of the fabric itself, not the design you plan to make. You have your garments design, and then you have a design of the fabric itself. Now, of course, I'm coming from a place where I most of the time am doing reproduction vintage sewing. I'm trying to make things that replicate a look from the 1940s, 50s, 30s, different time periods. And so because I'm trying to replicate earlier styles, I'm often looking for colors and prints that will also replicate those decades well. So I don't really want to use a very like blocky mid-century print on like a 1940s design. If I'm doing so, I want to do so very intentionally. You can mix and match these things. You can make 1940s dresses out of Star Wars print fabric. This is done all the time. And in fact, one of my catalogs, I did see a 1950s like button-down shirt for teens in the teenage or like junior section of the Montgomery Ward's catalogs that had a comic book strip print, which is something I feel like is such a modern thing we would think of, like buying a comic strip fabric, like novelty quilting cotton from Joann's and then making a vintage garment out of it. I see people do that kind of thing all the time, but it's actually still even quite accurate, funny enough. So color and pattern of the fabric are very much open to your design choices. This is where your choice in them, like your design inspiration, like your own personal point of view, artistic point of view is starting to come through in your choices here, is like you can choose something completely anachronistic if you want to. But if you are trying to reproduce something and make it look quite authentic, it's important to know what styles of patterns were used in the area you're trying to replicate, what types of fabrics were used in the kind of era that you're trying to replicate. So it is something to keep in mind if you are going for a more authentic kind of look. So for example, an Art Deco print works great for 1930s dresses. A tiny floral is good for early 1940s things. A larger floral is great for late 1940s things, and something more mid-century modern works great for something, well, more mid-century modern like a 1950s dress. So that's like our word cloud of all the considerations we need when choosing a fabric in general for design. But how do you know how to then take all that information about a textile and translate it into knowing which textile to choose for which design? Let's say I have this vintage pattern and I have no indication of what fabric to use, except you kind of already do know some things, right? You know you're not going to use like a super thick wool coating, are you? This is a drapier design. We're going to need something that is going to floop into these swags and things like that. So we don't need a like hardy, crisp denim, so cotton twills are out. That's what denim is made out of. Tiny gathering will always lay smoother in a lighter weight of fabric, so anything thick is out really. Lightweight gauzy wool would work, but this seems less like, necessarily wintry. So flowy option includes, say, like a rayon challis, a rayon twill, a rayon crepe, a silk georgette if you want it to be matte, a silk charmeuse if you want it to be shiny, a chiffon if you want it to be sheer. A cotton lawn would work, but it's going to have a certain crispness that isn't exactly what's depicted here. So when you have a design like this, you do have a lot of options still. The results are just going to be a little bit different. And I often use the same patterns, or like my same, modifications to my blocks to make very different looking dresses, and it's just because the textile is different. There's always a certain crispness to cotton unless it is, again, a super loose weave. Then it has a lot more drape to it. But even lighter weight cottons like a voile or lawn still have a certain body to them, like they hold out a puff sleeve more than a rayon will. If you put a rayon challis and a cotton lawn, which are both thin and like, they have a lot of movement to them if you are flooping them around, but in a sleeve, in gathering, the cotton one is still going to stick up a little bit more. If you've ever seen a silk organza, it has a lot more crispness than a chiffon, even though they both are like very, very lightweight sheer silks. One has so much more crisp body to it, and the other is very floopy. So even when you have something, the same fiber, the same weave, like chiffon and organza are both plain weave fabrics. It's just over under. There's nothing fancy in the weaves, but because of the other properties of how they're constructed, the fabric itself is constructed, they have completely different results when it comes to the body. So it's another thing to consider. Like even if you just want a sheer silk, you're going to want to know if you want an organza to like hold out a puff sleeve or a chiffon to have a droopy one. Oh, but Bianca, I don't know all these fancy names like chiffon and charmeuse and georgette and blah blah. Why is it all French? Listen, I know. They're all strange names, and how are you going to learn them? But I also kind of question if you need to. Like if you are making a lot of formal wear, then you will need to know the different fancy names for silk. But I've never, ever had occasion to use a silk charmeuse personally, even in fashion school, because A, it's expensive, and 2, I just don't make a lot of 1930s evening gowns, So like I question, do you need to know all these fancy names? Like what are you planning on making? This is important. If you are planning on making more 1930s flowy silk kind of garments, then yeah, you're going to want to learn more about silk. But if you want to make like mid-century summer dresses, the odds that you're going to make one out of a silk charmeuse are very slim unless you're making like a bridesmaid's dress. And at that point, it's like, if you're making something quite special, do more research. But for everyday kind of wardrobe building sewing, you're just not going to need most of these fancy silk names or need to know about a lot of fancier sounding French named fabrics, because I don't see why you would need to use them. They're going to be much more expensive. They're going to be dry clean only and much more formal looking in the completed garment. So they're not very everyday kind of fabrics. So do you really need to know the difference between a georgette and a charmeuse? If you're making formal wear, if you intend to, then yes, but I don't see why most people would need to know. You know what I mean? You're going to have probably a niche and stick down into it. And even if you don't intend on having a niche of, like if you want to make 30s things and 1960s things, you want to do the gamut. You want to make formal wear and you want to make loungy clothes around the house. You want the full range of all the things. You're still going to I think it's best to probably start with a few fabrics and then just keep adding to your arsenal about ones that you know about instead of trying to learn everything all at once. If you do want a good overview, if you want to start knowing what these names mean, again, even if you're not shopping with them, I highly recommend going onto moodfabrics.com because the way they organize their website is by fiber and then by weave, and then you can read about that weave on the main page and then look at the different fabrics, and you can click on those fabrics and it will tell you again in the descriptions more about them. Sometimes they even have videos showing the fabric, so you can go in there and click cotton, sateen. It'll tell you a little bit about cotton sateen at the top. It'll show you all their cotton sateens. You can click on one and it'll say, this one's a little bit lighter weight, more like a shirting. And so then you know this is a sateen that is done in a lighter weight. And sometimes they'll even have a video for you to see what it looks like in movement. You still can't feel it, but at least you can get a little bit better idea. But I just think that Mood actually is a really good resource for learning about fabric terms because they have everything on offer. So if you go into their silk category, you go to apparel fabrics, silk fabrics, go through their drop-down menus, and then you can see all the different ones. Crepe, georgette, crepe de chine, I'm trying to think of other silks, chiffons, organzas, taffetas. They all have different properties to them, and they have descriptions for them online. So it's kind of, the books about this kind of stuff are usually quite expensive, especially because there's some books out there that have actual swatches in them, so you can feel the fabrics, which is amazing. But because those books were incredibly expensive to make, to have swatches of fabric inside the books, not just because of the fabric needed, but just because to make a book and like bind a book that has fabric samples in it is a whole different ball game. So those books are usually quite expensive, but at least you can go ahead and like have an online mental swatch book just from doing this kind of research, going through fabric shops that do know what they're talking about. That way, if you have a kind of a mental image and a small knowledge base of what a georgette is supposed to look and feel like, when you are shopping online and someone says they have woven silk fabric and they don't know what it is, hopefully because you kind of are familiar with what one might look like from poking around Mood, you'll be able to determine what it is you're looking at when it comes to mystery fabrics more and more often. I would say 90% of the time I have ever like rudely thought to myself, oof, not exactly the right fabric choice, you know, which I try not to be a judgmental human, but I am human, unfortunately. But like I've ever thought like, oh, this kind of looks like a beginner project, which happened to me most often in life when I was in fashion school, judging my peers in class, which, you know, it was a petty time. And if you think that fashion school kids aren't competitive in class, you would be wrong. But I would say 90% of the time I ever had that thought is because someone used something that was too thick or like too heavy of a weight. Like if you're doing like a 1930s like floaty summer dress, it's just going to look different if you use a like cotton voile or a quilting cotton. And the quilting cotton is just going to have a certain heaviness to it that a lighter weight cotton wouldn't have. And it's unfortunate because, of course, quilting cotton is, I would say, probably the most fabrics available to the home sewer in America, at least, are quilting cottons, which means that most of the designs and prints and all that fun stuff are available in quilting cotton, but not in apparel cotton. But apparel cotton is just always going to look a little bit more like it was supposed to be apparel, and quilting cotton always is a little bit too heavy for stuff. So get online, that's a great resource. But then also, of course, if you have fabric stores in your area, even Joann's, but preferably nicer fabric stores, I suppose, go to those, not with the intention of buying a fabric, but good luck getting out of there without doing so, but go there with the intention of learning. So instead of walking in and beelining straight for the sale table, which I've been there, just go ahead and take a tour of that whole place, go up and down the aisles, feel things, see what they're called. Feel things, see what they're called, and like kind of take mental notes so that you can have, again, this kind of swatch book, a mental swatch book in your brain so that you know, oh yeah, I remember I felt that voile. It was a nice like lightweight sheer cotton. That might be good for this 30s dress I had in mind, and like start putting things together because you've had some experience with it. If you have no experience with different textiles, it's going to be very difficult to imagine out of all the textiles available, which one you want to use for a design. So you just have to start filling up those buckets in your brain so you know what a twill is, you know what a cotton twill feels like because you felt one before at the fabric store. So I know at least at Joann's, they usually put the names, at least of the fiber content, and then also usually the like name of the fabric itself. Sometimes it'll say like bottom weights, which I guess at least tells you that they think that you should make a pants or a skirt out of it, but it isn't actually super helpful. But they usually put the names of the fabrics somewhere, so you can kind of start putting two and two together in your head and build yourself a library in your brain. Just go like on a study trip to a fabric store. But again, I am sorry about the fabric that you will inevitably accidentally buy when you do find something on sale while on that more research sort of trip. The other thing about swatches too as well, speaking of swatch books, is that you can usually from online stores order swatches. So if you want to be positive of a color or the weight of something, you can usually order swatches. I'm far too impatient for anything like this. I don't ever order swatches of anything. I just order fabric, and if it doesn't work for the project I had in mind, I will just put it in the stash and use it later for something else. So yeah, there's a lot to learn here, but really it depends on what you're planning on making most of the time. If you are ever going to use, again, like 50% of the textiles out there, if not more. I'm never going to use a silk gazar, for example. I don't need to know much about it because I know that it's very expensive, and they used it to like make Kate Middleton's wedding gown. And I'm personally never going to be making any royal wedding gowns, so I probably don't need to know anything about silk gazar other than that I don't need to know anything about it. Another small note here before I forget, by the way, the question, how much fabric will I need to make a dress, or how much fabric will I need to make this project that you made? Like if you see me making a project and you're like, how much fabric would I need for this? This is an impossible question for me, again, to answer because fabric comes in different widths and so does your pattern. So everyone's a different size and therefore everyone's pattern might be a different size. So some people may be able to like cut pattern pieces side by side that other people would need to cut separately because of the width of the fabric is different and the width of the pattern itself is different. So every different design of dress is going to have different yardage requirements. Every different size of that same design is going to have different yardage requirements. And then the yardage itself comes in either like 45 or 60 width. And like obviously if something is 45 width, you might not be able to arrange your pattern pieces next to one another. You might have to arrange them, lengthwise. And if something is 60 inches wide, you'd be able to fold it and still put pattern pieces right next to each other and cut them out. So you'll need less fabric overall. So this is one of those things where it's just like, who knows how much fabric you will need? It's very personalized. You're gonna have to measure your pattern to find out how much fabric you need, especially if like you're going to cut parts of it on the bias. It's a whole different consideration. But basically what I'm saying is no one can answer this question for you. And please remember to look at the width of fabric when you're buying fabric online. Or in person even, because, for example, because I shop with Mood, it's usually like Mood designer fabrics. Designer fabrics, apparel fabrics are usually come in wider widths, so they'll come in a 54 or even a 60 width. So a lot of times I can get away with buying only 2.5 yards to make something because it's so wide. I can lay out pattern pieces next to one another. I'll usually have enough left over for something doing that. Whereas if I was sometimes when I'm shopping anymore, because I'm so used to having wide width fabrics, and I'd rather only have to buy less yardage, because it's less expensive that way. If I do find a fabric I really like vintage fabric or something like that, and it says like only 40 width, I'm like, no. Because then I have to buy like 6 yards to make a dress that otherwise I would have to buy 3 yards if it was wide width fabric. So just make sure to keep in mind how wide the fabric is. Make sure you look at that as well. But when it comes down to how exactly I personally do this, taking all these considerations into account, how do I personally choose a fabric for a design I have in mind, or choose a design for a fabric I have in my stash? Let's go through and I'll show you some like example projects and fabrics that would work for them. So if I have a structured design, say a 1950s dress like this, I'll use a cotton sateen personally, 99% of the time. Other honorable mentions include a cotton piqué, which is a new favorite of mine. This particular one from Mood I really quite like. It's definitely on the thicker side, but it's good for structured designs. Also a cotton twill or a wool suiting, and then I will usually line that if I'm doing something structured as well. If I have a crisp summery design like this one, I will go for a lighter weight cotton like a voile or lawn, or maybe even a poplin if I'm looking for something like fully opaque. And then if I have a drapey or flowy design, something more like these 1940s crepe dresses, we know, for example, that usually in the 1940s they were made of rayon crepe or crepe silk, so that is probably what I will use as well, just because that's the kind of thing, like from shopping vintage or from reading vintage catalogs, I just know that's what these were made out of, and so I will just use the correct textile for them, as it were. So that's one of those things where it's like, also look at vintage references, and they will usually tell you what type of fabric something is made out of. And also in the fabric pages of, say, a Montgomery Ward's catalog, usually it will tell you what kind of designs a fabric would be good for as well. So it goes both ways in these old catalogs as well. But if I have a drapey design like this, I will, use a rayon crepe, rayon challis, or a rayon twill, or various silks if I'm feeling very expensive. Some suiting wools are lightweight enough to use for something like this, but something can be heavier or crisper, so I always read the descriptions when it comes to something like a suiting wool. Suiting wool is, again, like a description that a fabric retailer might use that actually isn't a description of a particular weave or fabric itself. It's many different textiles that are all usually of a good weight for suiting. So you can have wool twill suiting, and you can have like plain weave wool suiting. It's all going to be in the suiting category, but the weaves will still be different. So it's important, again, to read the descriptions to see if it's something that's like a soft wool twill or a crisp wool twill, because the crisper the fabric, the better it's going to be for structured things, and the drapier a fabric, the better it will be for drapier designs. When it comes to making something, say like a suiting jacket, which, as we know, I don't do because I'm not exactly qualified, but you're going to need a medium to heavier weight fabric that is going to hold structure. The lighter weight and drapier your fabric, the more interlining, stiffenings, and interfacings you're going to have to use to make anything structured and tailored out of it. So when it comes to actually pairing textile and design together, the more simply cut and streamlined a design, the more structured and fitted a design, the better it is to have a crisper or heavier weight fabric. I say crisper because you can have something like a silk taffeta, which is extremely lightweight usually. Like, it doesn't weigh anything. It feels very light, but it holds a pressed edge really well. It has a very crispy, crinkly, you can imagine that taffeta sound body to it. It has a lot, it will hold out a design. It has a stiffness and body, to it. So, like, again, organza and taffeta are very lightweight silks, but they have so much crispness to them. They will hold anything they will hold the design up. They will hold their own shape much better than something like a chiffon will. So those are still something that you can make a suit out of. You can make an organza suit if you want to. It is going to be sheer. You probably have to line it in something else or in itself to get enough body out of it, but it will still have one. So the more structured and simple design, the more crisp and heavier weight of fabric you can get away with using. The more floopy and drapey a design, the more drapey of a fabric you're going to want for that. The more gathering you have, the thinner a fabric is going to need to be able to fit in that much section. If you can imagine like trying to gather a denim into like a 1930s design like this, it's just not going to work very well. It's going to be too stiff. It's going to look heavy and costumey and strange. And sometimes, honestly, especially in like costume design, we're doing this on purpose, but most of the time I feel like this is an accidental situation and you want to avoid it. If you want a denim look 1930s dress like this, you're going to want to use a chambray, which is like a ultra lightweight denim look situation, as opposed to denim itself, which is very thick usually. It has been hard for me to even try and figure out how to explain how I do this, because at this point it is quite second nature to me. But I say that with like the caveat of like that I am not, it's not like I have all this knowledge banked in my head to call upon. It's just that whenever I design anything, I'm automatically thinking like, okay, if it's structured, I'll use a sateen. Okay, if it's floopy, I'll use a rayon crepe. I just have one or two fabrics that I always go to. It's not like I go through the whole Rolodex of every fabric for any, like, as a potential for any design. No, I have like a handful of fabrics that I use for anything. And it's just like, if I'm structured, I'll use these three. If it's floopy, I'll use these three. And I just have my go-to fabrics. And so I don't need to know about every single fabric under the sun, because I always just am going to buy like the same 6 textiles anyhow. I can eliminate so many things within these considerations. So if I'm thinking about fiber, okay, boom, I take out literally 50% of the fabrics on offer because I don't use any man-made materials other than rayon. Like most of the time I'm never going to be looking at polyester. So boom, I've separated like 50% of textiles out of the running. And then once I look at weaves, weaves versus knits, I always use woven. So knits, boom, are out. So like I can eliminate so many choices just because of my own preferences automatically that I get narrowed down to those 10 or so favorite fabrics quite quickly anyhow. So I only am ever going to be using those few fabrics unless I have a very special or particular project that I need a fabric with a different property that I'm not used to. Now, other questions you may have, because I haven't talked about these things, is what if I want to use knits? What if I want to know about knits? What if I want to make like more contemporary style clothing instead of like vintage style clothing? What if I want to make like looser fit clothing, which I always, everything I make is always very like contoured to the body. And the thing is, I am just not the expert for you. I'm not an expert in any of those things. I'm not even a novice in any of those things. I've never I've worked with knits 1 or 2 times. I'm not, well, this is funny because I actually worked with swimwear fabric quite a lot because I worked in a factory that used swimwear fabric. So I've worked with swimwear fabric a ton, but not actually to make proper swimwear. One day I'll tell you the whole story. It's starting to sound more and more confusing the more I talk about it. But let's just say I have no experience making clothing out of knits. I can't teach you about it because I don't know anything about it. And for me, in my own personal sewing, I make vintage reproduction things. Most vintage before the 1960s wasn't done in knits. You do have 1940s knit dresses. They're just not the kind I make. So I am just not the expert for you when it comes to those things. There are a bunch of people out here on the internet, and I'm sure you'll be able to find someone who can guide you in the right direction for those sort of things. You don't actually have to know everything about textiles in order to be a competent home sewer, to build your own wardrobe, a home sewn wardrobe, especially to build your own vintage inspired home sewn wardrobe. You don't have to know everything about textiles. You just have to start to know what is going to work best for the particular designs you have in mind. That's why it's kind of hard to answer this question, because like, what textile is best for me making my dresses? It's like, I don't know what kind of dresses you want to make. If you want to make 1930s things, it's one thing. If you want to make 1960s things, it's another. So I'm hoping to try and just give you kind of tools to be able to start to make these decisions yourself, or ideas about what to investigate, because it is such, again, a customized question. Like, how much fabric will I need? I don't know. Like, what type of fabrics are going to be best for me? I don't know, because I don't know exactly what types of designs you are most interested in. So it's hard for me to answer that without like having to answer everyone individually, which would take a long time, unfortunately. I'm happy to answer those kinds of questions. Like, if I want to make this dress and you link to me on Pinterest, I'll be like, dude, try a sateen. It'll be fine. But like, I just can't do it because of the volume, I suppose. Like, every once in a while, I like try and answer like specific questions. But if I tried to answer all the questions I get at this point, it would be like a second full-time job, unfortunately. So I'll try and answer your questions if you put them in the comments below. It just may not be timely, but I might get to them eventually. I am going to go ahead and make a separate video all about my top favorite textiles that I myself use in my own sewing all the time, because again, like, this is kind of a more individual choice thing, like, or individual opinion piece almost. This today is like more of an introduction into how to choose fabrics for anyone. What exactly fabrics I use 90% of the time, I'm going to go ahead and make a separate video all about my top like handful of fabrics that I always use, including of course cotton sateen, since I never shut up about it. So I'm going to give you those details in a separate video coming early next week, and then we will have another Thursday video next week as well. So 2 videos next week. I'm throwing that one in there as a bonus just because I realized there wasn't going to be time for it in this video, because I'm sure it's already quite long. Thank you as always for watching this video today. I hope it was at least somewhat helpful, and I'll be back here with more fabric information and of course sewing and vintage fashion real soon. Bye.